Welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen here with life coach Cindy Chavez. Today is Wednesday, February the 5th, 2020, 4 p.m. New York time. Wherever you are in the world, thanks for joining us for another episode of LOA Today, your daily dose of happy. And I'm happy that we're back on Neville Day. Happy Neville Day, everybody. Wednesdays are Neville days around here. And we've been working on off and on through vacations and winter storms and everything else. But we've been working on Seedtime and Harvest, which is our ninth book. It's not Neville's, but it's our ninth book since we started the series. Yeah, think about that. We've talked about that a few times lately, but it's just kind of like, wow, we've really been doing a lot of books.
Right? We have. And I think that every time we've done one, I've learned something new. Mm-hmm. And every time, even if we go back, I always say that, but I bet if we went back and did these 9 books again, they'd feel different.
They probably would.
No, it's weird. It's like you can't step into the same river twice, they say. And I really understand that. That's the way I understand it the most is with books, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm a nerd and I love to read. And I have a handful of books that I read over and over, and some of them are Neville books, and always different the next time around. But
it makes sense because, we talk a lot about perspective. Our perspectives are constantly changing and shifting. Right. Particularly those of us who are really working on personal growth, that perspective is going to change substantially over time. Right. So yeah, you're right. No wonder it's going to look different every time we read it. We could read the same book 3 weeks in a row and it would be different every day.
It's funny too, sometimes after you've been on this journey a while and you read a book for the second or third time, it's like the third time you'll read something and it will be such an aha, such clarity around it. And then you think, one of two things, either I don't ever remember reading that before. Like I've read this book twice or 3 times or whatever. I don't ever remember that. Or what did I even think of that the first time I read it? It's like, I don't think I understood that the first time I read it. But that's good. That's fun. It's like, how they always ask that question about what music or what book or whatever movie, if you could only have one and you're stranded on a desert island, it might be a Neville book because I always thought
that Desert Island was very well stocked with all the different ways that people, organize that question. But right. Tom Hanks might disagree with me, but
we find the desert island and it's like it's like the library at Alexandria. Like, right. What was I worried
about? Absolutely. Well, actually, the other thing that happens, and I experienced this last night, I had been aware, of course, of Dr. Joe Dispenza's book, You Are the Placebo, for quite some time. And I remember starting to read it a few years back, and I got a few chapters in and just wasn't really syncing with me, so I never finished it. But I got it again for the trip that Louise and I took to Florida because I needed reading materials down and back on the plane. Got about 2/3 of the way through. It was okay. And then last night, I got toward the end where he starts telling some of the success stories. And there was the one success story about the woman named Lori. I don't know if you remember that one.
I don't know.
She's the one who was experiencing a degenerative bone disease. Her bones were all breaking all the time. It started when she was 18, 19 years old, 17 years old, continued for the next 30 years, and had apparent psychological energy connections to her father, who used to beat everybody in the family. So this was her way of protecting herself, because if she had fragile bones, then he wouldn't attack her. And it was just like this, really incredibly horrible situation. And I don't even remember what the name of the disease was, but it was a disease that basically crippled her. And she used techniques that basically Neville talks about, that Dr. Dispenza talks about based on his experience, his research with placebos, and she's healed herself.
Wow.
Completely healed herself. Now, it took her it took a long time. It took a long time, years, 30 years for her to, first of all, learn it. And second of all, unlearn all the stuff that she needed to unlearn, and keep trying every day to visualize her life being better, even though it seemed impossible and she didn't believe a word of it and so forth. But she persisted and persisted and persisted until finally she had the breakthrough. And I was thinking about some of the Neville stories where, he's talking about these, what we would almost call miraculous manifestations.
Right.
This woman's manifestation, I think, ranks up there with anything that he wrote about, in part because of the detail that Dr. Dispenza goes into. But the other thing that really caught my attention is this story takes 16 pages. Neville's take maybe a half a page, you know.
Wow. Well, a couple things came to mind when you were talking about it. One, of course, is persistence.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And what I want to say about that really quickly is that Walt, you started a Facebook page.
Yep.
Right? Where everyone is posting their little vignettes.
Right.
And the name of the page, is it LOA Today, Pivot Pals?
It's Law of Attraction Pivot Pals.
Law of Attraction Pivot
Yeah.
Pals.
Yeah.
And what's really cool, and it took me a long time to go over there and post something. I said, oh yeah, I need to do that. And I kept forgetting about it. But as you see, my wrist is in a brace. I've talked about it the last few podcasts. It's been in the brace for about a month. And it was definitely getting better, but very, very slowly, right? Like my husband kept saying, how's your wrist? I said, I can tell that it's better, but it's not a lot better. It was moving very, very slowly. And so I kept doing this vignette at night when I would fall asleep. And then sometimes I'd just forget about it and wouldn't do it for a few days. Then, of course, my wrist would hurt. I'd remember. So I went over and I typed it up into the Pivot Pals group. I said, I've got a very simple vignette going on over here. The vignette is simply that I'm writing with my favorite pen. I can feel my pen in my hand. I can feel the paper, my left hand on the paper. So I feel the paper. I'm having a coffee. I can smell and taste the coffee. And I hear myself say as I'm writing to my husband, I am so happy to be writing again without pain. That's pretty simple, right? Like it takes longer for me to describe it than for me to actually do it.
And it's right in the vein of what Neville talked about. It's exactly the way he said to do it.
Right. And so I posted it over there, and now that it's there, I'm reminding myself to go over and to do the exercise, and then to go over and just make a note. Like I've just been putting a check mark, right? Like I did it today.
Yep.
And I can tell you that in the week that I've been doing it, my hand is really starting to improve much quicker. Like it's sort of like, wow, now it's picking up speed. So I think that's, I want to encourage everybody, if you're doing these Neville methods that we've been teaching, if you're doing these vignettes, go over there and join that group and like get some support, because it's fun, when you post, okay, I did this today, other people will, like it or comment, and it feels like you've got like a team of people supporting you. So that's important. The other thing that I think is really interesting about what you just said, recently, I celebrated 10 years of being a certified coach.
Woo-hoo!
This week, I was actually cleaning, and the certificate, I looked at it and it said February 3rd, 2010. I was like, oh my gosh. So I wrote a post about it, and in the post, I mentioned a dozen ideas, not that I've learned in these 10 years, but that I already knew 10 years ago. They were the ideas that like pulled me through when times were tough. They were the ideas that I hung on to and that I got to it. I wanted these ideas to be like in my bones, so they were there, automatic. And one of them was the problem and the solution is the same thing. That's probably the first of all those ideas that I learned years and years ago that's really been important in my life. And somebody commented in the thread and said, can you explain that? Like, how can that possibly be? The problem and the solution are the same thing. And you just gave a great example of that. This woman's body created a disease in her body where her bones were fragile as the solution to being beaten by her father.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It was the problem. Boy, she's got a problem. Her bones are fragile, but it was also the solution, right? It was solving something else for her. And we do this all the time. It may not be as dramatic as a fragile bone thing, but we do it all the time. And I think it's interesting to recognize that, our bodies our subconscious doesn't make judgments, right? So as a child, if she had the thought, if my bones were fragile, he wouldn't be beating me. Sometimes our subconscious like, okay. Our subconscious does not say, oh, that's a bad idea. And in one of the Neville books, he talked about this, that the subconscious doesn't say, oh, no, think of something better. That's not a great idea. Right. Like we would do as people, right? We would say, oh, no, like you don't want to do that to yourself. And we've talked about this before, the idea that when we're small, in our country anyway, in America anyway, and when you go to school, almost the only thing that can get you out of school is being sick.
True. Mm-hmm.
right? You can't just say, hey, Mom, I feel like sitting home and watching cartoons today. Okay, I'll write you a note. And the school says, oh, that's cool. No, that doesn't happen. But if you say, Mom, I don't feel good today. Oh, okay, we'll write you a note. And the school says, okay. And, I recognize we can't just be, fooling around all the time. We have to have an education or whatever. But I also see that we go through life for like the first 12, 16, whatever years of our life, we have this trained into us that like, how do you get out of something? You get sick, right?
Yeah.
It's not okay to say, I really don't want to do that. But if we say, oh, I'm sorry, I really wanted to go with you to that thing, but I'm feeling a little under the weather. And people do this all the time, right? They call in sick when they're not really sick. They may give a loved one I had a client that told me, she said, I didn't want to go to the Easter thing my family was having because it's just not my thing. I didn't want to go. So I said, I'm really feeling under the weather. She said the next day I woke up with like a bad cold. And I did this to myself.
Right.
Right? The body says, okay.
It's a great point. In fact, that was actually part of the Dispenza story about this woman named Lori who had the bone disease because her father passed at some point during that 30-year period. I'm going to say 10 years in. I don't remember exactly what it was. But after he passed, she continued to decline, despite the fact that she was working on what Dispenza had taught her. And what they realized was that she was declining because she was getting so much of her needs met by being a handicapped person.
Yes.
And she didn't want to give that up.
Right.
I mean, not consciously, subconsciously, she didn't want to give that up.
Right.
So she had not only did she have to kind of reverse and unlearn all the stuff that happened because of the relationship with the father, but now she had to reverse all this stuff about being handicapped.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, that's what I said. Wow.
So before we get into the Neville book, and I know we probably have announcements, but I want to ask one question.
Sure.
About, we were talking about reading a book and then reading it again and getting even more out of it, or, getting something different. And you had said you started to read this book like a few years back and it's like, wasn't really into it. And then you read it, and now you read it on your trip. Did you have the experience of like, why wasn't I into this before?
Kind of, sort of, but not really, because I know why I wasn't into it before.
Okay.
The reason I wasn't into it before was because at that time, I believed that I could not meditate successfully, and I knew that this book was leading up to a whole thing about meditation.
Right.
And
that makes sense.
So it kind of just put me off, This time around, I said, okay, well, yeah, now I've learned how to meditate more effectively. I still don't meditate all the time. I'm not totally enthusiastic about it, but at least now I can probably read the book and get through it and maybe get some good stuff out of it. And indeed, I've gotten a lot more out of it than I thought. So in that sense, yes, it did play out the way you talked about.
Got it. Yeah. Because I've had that happen. I've had books that I just could not get into. Maybe tried 3 or 4 times and just couldn't get into them. And then 3 years later, I pick it up and I'm like glued to it. I think, what was wrong with me before? Why didn't I get this before? Anyway, so that's kind of funny. So, hey, I just say that too. I have had people tell me before that they've started to read Neville. It's like, well, try again.
Well, I'll tell you, we also are talking about how the perspective can change, and that's why you can read the book one week to the next and get different stuff out of it. I have a perspective that I've been really latched onto for about the last year and a half or so of wanting to spend as much time as I possibly can focusing on what I like and taking as much attention away as I can from what I don't like, and to the point where I start to get annoyed whenever I'm presented with stuff that I don't like. And I'm reading the book, and Dispenza loves to present the really extreme cases to make, a startling point. But so many of them were cases like I didn't even want to read them because they were talking about such horribly negative situations, which the last time that I looked at the book, I probably would not have reacted that way. So the thing that actually would have gotten me through the book the last time actually slowed me down this time. It's going to change every single time.
It's true.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I got to the really good part because it's
I'm
like 3 stories in a row.
I love that story, and this has been an interesting conversation so far already, right off the bat, before we even got into the book. So,
and we can hardly even get into it because we have to do the announcements first. So we better do that and get right into the book. And as Cindie pointed out, we want you to be members of the Law of Attraction Pivot Pals group. because it works and people are getting benefit out of it. And a small percentage of our listeners are actively doing it. I am very pleased to say a number of people kind of took my challenge and started not only placing the vignettes, but revisiting their vignettes and marking the fact that they're revisiting them. So people are taking it seriously. They're saying, yeah, I want to make change in my life. I want to improve things. So congratulations to everybody who's doing that. And for the rest of you who haven't done it, join us. Join the group. We'll let you in. Just say that you're a listener. We'll let you right in. You can post your vignette. And you get, like you say, you get really, really nice, positive feedback. I truly believe it's one of the most positive groups on Facebook for that reason, because we don't really allow anything else. It's just about us doing our vignettes. It's just that and that alone. So you really can't go wrong with that, unless your vignette is really, really miserable, and we haven't had that one yet. So.
I don't think that's happened yet.
I don't think it's going to happen.
At that point, you have to say, look, if everybody gets to choose what they want to create.
Right, exactly.
You want to create, a big load of misery, that's okay.
We'll go, applause. We also want people to become subscribers to the podcast. Most of you who are listening have already figured out how to do that. If you haven't figured it out, it's really easy. Just go to the homepage of our website, loatoday.net, and at the top you'll find instructions. You just click it, usually one click, sometimes two, depending on what your device is and what apps you got installed and so forth. But 1, 2, maybe 3 clicks later, you're subscribed, and then all of the episodes that we create come streaming right to your device as we publish them every single day. Also, check us out on YouTube, because we live stream to YouTube as we record these Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, New York time. And so you can actually see what we look like as we're doing these shows. And you can join people like Nasha and Jeffrey, who are currently logged in on the live stream, and share comments that we will include on the show. So, become a live streamer, and you don't also have to be a live streamer in order to watch YouTube. You can actually watch recordings of it. That's what the little bell is that you click when you subscribe. It'll notify you whenever we publish something new. So check us out both ways. We love to be watched as well as listened to. So those are our announcements for the day.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, let's see. We're on chapter 8.
Oh, Nasha also has some stuff that she's posted here. I wanted to see if there's anything here that we need to bring right in. Well, she has a question. It's kind of outside of what we're about to be talking about with Neville, but I'll bring it up anyway. I don't really know this particular author, but maybe you do. She says, I wanted to know, when Joseph Murphy writes in his book that don't tell anyone about your dreams, what's your take on that? This is the one thing that stops me to post.
Well, I'm curious if, apparently, I'm assuming, that when you say dreams, you mean like intentions, goals, and dreams kind of dreams, and not literal nighttime sleeping dreams. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of teachers that talk about not telling people, and I tend to veer more towards, number one, I listen to my intuition. So sometimes if I'm going to share something and I definitely feel like a check in my, then I want to listen to that and not share. But beyond that, I think sharing with people that are going to support those dreams is what's important. That's kind of like what the Pivot Pals, page is over there. Like when you're sharing a vignette, people over there are going to be supportive. And just like we joked a minute ago, your vignette may not be something that rings our bells. That doesn't matter. If it's what you want, then, so I think that's the real key. It's not that you don't ever share it at all with anyone, but we all have people who love us very much and are very well-meaning and will try to protect us from taking a big risk. And so we may say, I have a big dream of doing this and that. They don't want us to be disappointed. And they'll say, well, that's kind of a long shot, and they're not supportive, right? So that's my answer to the question anyway, is
I think you nailed it.
Share with people that are going to be supportive of whatever it is.
Yeah, I don't ever follow a rule blindly and with 100% certainty regardless. I always ask myself, does it apply what I'm doing right now? If it applies, then use it. If it doesn't apply, then do something else instead. But I try not to let rules govern my life, because I'm the creator here.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So the creator gets to decide.
Yeah. but share with people that are going to be supportive.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't share with people who I had a pretty good idea were going to shoot down what I'm doing either. I mean, what would be the point in that? That's just no. That's like setting yourself up.
What I think happens though sometimes is, we get inspired, and inspiration feels really good,
Mm-hmm.
right? I like to explain the difference between motivation and inspiration like this. Motivation is we're motivated to do something because we don't want a result,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, I'm motivated to take care of myself because I don't want to get sick again,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, there's nothing really wrong with that.
Nope.
But inspiration is like, I want to take care of myself because I have this vision of what it's like to be vibrantly healthy.
Yes.
And that vision just pulls me forward instead of sort of pushing me from behind with the motivation. Sometimes we get both, right? And the combination is really powerful. But when we feel inspired, sometimes we get really excited.
Mm-hmm.
And we might be so excited we want to bring that idea to somebody, and say, hey, guess what? I have this idea. This is really what I want. And we start overflowing with it. And it's not their inspiration. It's our inspiration. And they're like, I always joke being a Taurus, that's the earth sign. And everybody that I lived with was a fire sign, and they were the ones that always excited about something, and I was throwing the dirt on the fire, right? I was always the one that said, yeah, but have you thought about this? I don't think that's going to work. You need to, because I like to be logical. But that's the thing, is that sometimes whoever we're sharing with, they don't have that inspiration behind the idea like we do. And for them, they just sometimes try to protect us. So, sometimes it's hard to not share when we're excited.
Mm-hmm.
Just share with the right people. Share with somebody else who's going to be excited with you.
And it also, I would add, even if you happen to share and it's not well received by somebody, treat it like, instead of treating it like, oh my God, I just got shot down again, treat it like, well, maybe this is a little test. Can I keep myself in a high position despite the fact that they shot me down? And just kind of ignore what they said. Yeah, a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
So again, it's up to you. How are you going to do it?
All right. Well, let's see if we can. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did.
And let's see if we can make some headway on this chapter. The book is Seedtime and Harvest. We're almost ready to wrap it up. We've got 2 chapters left. This is chapter 8, called The Water and the Blood. So we're going to start right out with some verses from the Christian Bible. The first one is from John 3. It says, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. The second one is from John 19. It says, but one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. And the third verse from 1 John says, this is he that came by water and blood, even Jesus Christ, not by water only, but by water and blood. All right, so we're going to break out the Neville decoder rings now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this sounds like a decoder ring time. So, okay.
Now, here's what we know already, right, from our previous learning. We know that when Neville talks about the kingdom of God, when Neville talks about Jesus Christ, he is saying these things are your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So now what we're going to learn today, I hope, that will explain these verses in Nevilleese is what is water and what is blood then? Because the chapter title is The Water and the Blood.
Right.
So Neville says, according to the Gospel and the Epistle of John, not only must man be born again, but he must be born again of water and blood. These 2 inward experiences are linked with 2 outward rites, baptism and communion. But the 2 outward rites, baptism to symbolize the birth by water, and the wine of communion to symbolize acceptance of the blood of the Savior, cannot produce the real birth or radical transformation of the individual, which is promised to man. The outward use of water and wine cannot bring about the desired change of mind. We must therefore look for the hidden meaning behind the symbols of water and blood. The Bible uses many images to symbolize truth, but the images used symbolize truth on different levels of meaning. On the lowest level, the image used is stone. For example, a great stone was upon the well's mouth, and thither were the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep. from Genesis. And then from Exodus, they sank into the bottom as a stone. Neville says when a stone blocks the well, it means that people have taken these great symbolic revelations of truth literally. When someone rolls the stone away, it means that an individual has discovered beneath the allegory or parable its psychological life germ or meaning. This hidden meaning, which lies behind the literal words, is symbolized by water. It is this water, in the form of psychological truth, that he then offers to humanity. And then from Ezekiel 34, the flock of my pasture are men. Okay, so Neville is saying here that water symbolizes psychological truth.
I don't quite get how he draws that conclusion, but at least we know what the decoder ring is telling us. That's a good thing.
Right. So let's see if we can get clearer on that.
Okay.
He says the literal-minded man who refuses the cup of water, psychological truth, offered to him, sinks into the bottom as a stone. He remains on the level where he sees everything in pure objectivity without any subjective relationship. He may keep all the commandments written on stone, literally, and yet break them psychologically all day long. He may, for example, not literally steal the property of another, and yet see the other in want. To see another in want is to rob him of his birthright as a child of God, for we are all children of the Most High. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. That's the little broken part of a verse that he quotes here from Romans. So, okay, so let's just talk about this before we go any further.
Okay.
So we can try to be as clear as we can about what he's saying. He's talked about this before, about how we see other people. This is a really kind of hard hitting because basically Neville's saying here, well, you might not be a literal thief and steal property from people, but if you see them as being in want, then you're robbing them of their birthright. That's kind of a big, heavy responsibility that Neville's putting on us there.
No kidding. Yeah. He's basically saying you are always responsible for what you're focusing on, how it might impact somebody else. Like, oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little hard to swallow. And yet, one of the things that we've learned forever here is that when we think of people, literally think of people, whatever we're thinking of them, people in our lives, people that we care about, that we're not doing them any good if we're thinking things that cause us to feel bad. I hope I said that right.
I think you did.
When I'm thinking of, a relative and I know they're having a hard time and all my thoughts about them are about how much pain they're going through and how awful it is, and that's making me feel terrible. I'm really not, that's how I know my thoughts aren't really doing them any good.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know? Because I feel bad about these thoughts. So if I can switch my thoughts a little bit and hold a vision for them, that they're doing better, even if that's all that it is, they're doing a little better.
Mm-hmm.
That feels better to me.
Exactly.
That's the gauge of how I know, okay, these thoughts might be actually doing some good.
And I think there may be like a secondary message that you just touched on that he's implying here. It'll be interesting to see if he bears this one out, because the way you described it was about how you impact somebody else. But I wonder if he's also meaning how you impact yourself when you do that. In other words,
I think for certainly we'll see, but yeah.
I'll bet you that's a big piece of it, because everything he teaches is about basically taking responsibility in the truest sense of the word responsible, to be able to respond for your own consciousness.
Yes.
So at all times, you are the one who is conscious and aware of consciousness and aware of the choices that you're making. He's talking about being, what's the word, mindful? That's the word we use today. Yeah. He's talking about being mindful at all times, not for somebody else's sake, but for your own. And, oh, by the way, also for somebody else's sake as an adjunct.
And because we're all connected.
Right.
And because energy entrains to itself. So he's just mentioned seeing someone in want is like stealing from them.
Mm-hmm.
He says to know what to do about a seeming misfortune is to have the, quote, cup of water, the psychological truth that could save the situation. But such knowledge is not enough. Man must not only fill the pots of stone with water, that is, discover the psychological truth into wine. And this he does by living a life according to the truth which he has discovered. So we're talking here, and we've talked about this a lot because this is kind of a subtle thing. Living a life according to the truth which he has discovered. So we talk about these ideas all the time. But what did I say right at the beginning of the show? I said, it took me a long time to go over there and finally post my vignette.
Yeah.
Right? I know it works.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing it somewhat, but it took me a while to live life according to the truth which I discovered, right? To say, okay, I got to put this into action. This head knowledge is not helping my wrist. I've got to go a little further with it and put it into some kind of action. So we can read all these books and we can listen to podcasts and we can learn this stuff all day long. But if we don't start putting it into some kind of action, and it sounds like he's saying that is us taking the psychological truth, taking the water and turning it into wine. That's what happens when we get the results of living it.
The idea of turning water into wine is normally associated with miracles.
Yes.
And I think there is Neville calls all this stuff the law of assumption. He never calls it the law of attraction.
Right.
But it's basically the same concept. And in the law of attraction, one of the things that people are really attracted to LOA about is the fact that they can create these miraculous results. That's what I think he's talking about. He's talking about these miraculous results that we are now privy to the knowledge about how you go about creating them. Yeah. Well, okay. So he's saying if you aren't involved in the activity of filling the water pots with water and then turning that water into wine, you're not following through on the thing that you said you wanted to learn from the beginning.
Yeah. And he says, only by such use of the truth can he, quote, taste the water that was made wine. A man's birthright is to be Jesus. He is born to save his people from their sins. Now, quickly, we're going to make an aside here about the word sin for any new listeners. The word in the original language, it does not mean like a moral failure. It literally means to miss the mark, like you're shooting an arrow at a target and you don't hit the bullseye. Or maybe you don't even hit the target.
Yeah, that can be.
Right? And so what happens when you're doing that? You go get the arrow and you try again, right? And that is what he talks about when he talks about forgiveness of sin. Shooting the arrow again and doing better the next time. That's right. How you forgive it, right? And so he says here, a man's birthright is to be Jesus. He is born to save his people from their sins. What is sin? It's just missing it. Missing the mark of who we could be. So he says, but the salvation of a man is, and I love this actually, not by water only, but by water and blood. So if we look at what we've discovered so far, what his meaning is, he's saying you can't just know about these things. That's not going to save you. That's not going to change your life. To just know these things. It's when you put it into practice and you get the wine. The result, you turn these psychological truths into results by putting them into action. So he says to know what to do to save yourself or another is not enough. You must do it. Knowledge of what to do is water. Doing it is blood.
There it is, right there. Exactly.
This is he that came not by water only, but by water and blood. The whole of this mystery is in the conscious active use of imagination to appropriate that particular state of consciousness that would save you or another from the present limitation. Outward ceremonies cannot accomplish this. Then he has a quote here. There shall you meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wheresoever he shall go in, say ye to the good man of the house, the master saith, where's the guest chamber? Where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples, and he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. Whatsoever you desire is already furnished and prepared. Your imagination can put you in touch inwardly with that state of consciousness. If you imagine that you are already the one you want to be, you are following the man bearing a pitcher of water. If you remain in that state, you've entered the guest chamber. Passover and committed your spirit into the hands of God, your consciousness.
So let's take a moment and let's take a look at what we just said there, because he's finally laid out the decoding portion of the decoder ring.
Right?
He's made it clear that the water portion, like we were talking about before, the water portion is the discovery of that psychological truth, the psychological truth of how our consciousness works in creation, in the creative cycle. And the blood, he says it beautifully in that one line, knowledge of what to do is the water. So there it is. That's the water. Doing it is the blood. So in other words, it's not enough to do it. Just like you said a moment ago, it's not enough to know it. You got to do it. You got to take some action. You got to take this knowledge that you have and start applying it if you want to have the results that you want to have. And what are those results that you want to have there? Whatever you're bringing into this whole discussion in the first place that made you want to read Neville and understand what the heck he was talking about.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
That's the reason you're even looking at all this stuff.
That's it.
So, all right, okay, well then it's time to go do it. Get it done. And in the process, oh, by the way, as you get it done, you're going to find that, as he says here, the active use of imagination to appropriate that particular state of consciousness that would save you or another from the present limitation, you're going to discover that that is the whole mystery right there. How do you do that?
Yeah.
So he clears it up really nicely.
So remember, he's talked about consciousness. He says, committed your spirit into the hands of God - your consciousness.
Right.
Okay. So a man's state of consciousness is his demand on the infinite storehouse of God. And like the law of commerce, a demand creates a supply. To change the supply, you change the demand, your state of consciousness. What you desire to be, that you must feel you already are. Your state of consciousness creates the conditions of your life rather than the conditions create your state of consciousness. To know this truth is to have the water of life. All right. So, I love this because I talk about this a lot to coaching clients, right? That we think the things happening to us are causing us to feel a certain way or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in reality, we're creating that story. We're creating our experience by the story that we keep telling.
Right.
So this is what he's saying here. Your state of consciousness creates the conditions of your life.
It also draws to my mind the fact that the way Neville expresses it is his way of expressing it. The way Abraham Hicks expressed it is their way of expressing it. Joe Dispenza, we mentioned him a moment ago. He expresses it in terms of his exploration through his love of science and data collection and mm-hmm. gathering information, gathering data to understand how the whole thing works. But they basically all come to the same conclusion. Joe Dispenza says you are the placebo. And he doesn't just mean that about health.
Right.
That's one of the big takeaways from that book. It's about everything that you want in your life. It's not just about getting healthier, although certainly most of his test cases are about actually getting healthier. But it's literally about everything. And it's basically the recognition that a placebo is a way of saying, if you believe that it is true, it becomes true. Your belief makes it come true.
And it was Joe Dispenza that we talked about either last week or the week before, that when he was saying that your personality creates your personal reality.
Yes.
And what is your personality? It's how you think, how you feel, and how you act.
Yeah.
Right? And where does all of that come from? From your consciousness.
That's right.
Yeah. So Neville says, but your savior, right? Because he's just said to know this truth, the one we were just talking about, that your story is creating, that you are the placebo, that your story is creating your reality. He says to know this truth is to have the water of life.
Right.
But your savior, the solution of your problem cannot be manifested by such knowledge only. It can be realized only as such knowledge is applied. Same thing again.
I just had a rather humorous thought. There's a whole bunch of alcoholics saying, "Oh, good, the wine's going to save me. I knew it would."
Only as you assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Recognize there that Neville says assume, like the law of assumption. Only as you assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled and continue therein is your side pierced, from whence cometh blood and water. In this manner only is Jesus, the solution of your problem, realized.
Interesting. because in the past he has included Jesus in that litany of different terms that all mean consciousness or imagination. But now he's
Right?
given a variation on it, and if you equate it to imagination, it becomes really interesting in
Well,
this
because he's
manner
talking
only.
about feelings.
He's talking about feelings and imagination. He's
Yeah,
saying this thing, imagination, these feelings, that's the solution to your problem.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Then he quotes, "For thou must know that in the government of the mind, thou art thine own Lord and Master, that there will rise up no fire in the circle or whole circumference of the body and spirit unless thou awakes it thyself." You just made a comment that was very much like what he's saying here a little earlier. You said, I don't have to, adhere to any certain rule because I am the one that's creating my own reality, which is what he says here. Then he says, God is your consciousness. He says this over and over and over.
Oh, yes.
That our consciousness, that our imagination is God. His promises are conditional. Unless the demand, your state of consciousness, is changed, the supply, the present conditions of your life remain as they are. As we forgive, as we change our mind, the law is automatic. So we talked a moment ago about what that means about forgiveness. This is what he's talking about now.
Yeah, that's a nice decoder ring entry right there. Forgiveness is changing our mind.
Right. It's shooting in a different direction at the target, right?
Yes, right.
So it's almost like we change our aim.
Yeah, exactly.
Your state of consciousness is the spring of action, the directing force. There we go. That's changing your aim, right? The direction. And that which creates the supply. Then he quotes from Jeremiah, "If that nation against whom I have pronounced turn from their evil, I will repent of the evil that I thought to do unto them. And at what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to build and to plant it. If I do evil in my sight, that it obey not my voice, then I will repent of the good wherewith I said I would benefit them." Okay, let's see what Neville says about that. He says, This statement of Jeremiah suggests that a commitment is involved if the individual or nation would realize the goal. A commitment to certain fixed attitudes of mind. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is a necessary condition in man's search for the goal. So this is interesting because I think this is really true. And it's a question that I've asked clients before fairly often. And that is, how committed are you to achieving this? Because commitment is going to be important. Now, Neville says here that committing to doing the work, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. That's the support. That's the accountability support of the Pivot Pals group, actually.
It is. Yeah, exactly true. Yeah.
To keep us accountable for our commitment. So Neville says the story, yay, I love Neville's stories. The story I'm about to tell you shows that man is what the observer has the capacity to see in him. That what he is seen to be is a direct index to the observer's state of consciousness. This story is also a challenge to us all to shed our blood, to use our imagination, lovingly on behalf of another. There is no day that passes that does not afford us the opportunity to transform a life by the shedding of our blood. And then he quotes from Hebrews, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. All right, so that's interesting too, because we talked earlier about when Neville was talking about seeing someone as poor, was he said that was like stealing from them.
Well,
So
no, he's also taking it a step further. He says it quite directly, a challenge to us all to shed our blood, which means to use our imagination lovingly on behalf of another.
Right. Okay, so here's the story. One night in New York City, I was able to unveil the mystery of the water and the blood to a school teacher. I had quoted the above statement from Hebrews 9:22 and went on to explain that the realization we have no hope save in ourselves is the discovery that God is within us. That this discovery causes the dark caverns of the skull to grow luminous. And we know that the spirit of man is the candle of the Lord. And that this realization is the light to guide us safely over the earth. Then he quotes from Job, his candle shined upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. However, we must not look upon this radiant light of the head as God, for man is the image of God. God appears, and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night. But does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day? He quotes from Blake. But this must be experienced to be known. There is no other way, and no other man's experience can be a substitute for our own.
Key point right there.
Yeah.
Key point. Because we often, I think this kind of goes back again to the learning the knowledge thing and not applying it. We listen to teachers, we listen to gurus, we listen to lecturers, we listen to friends or people that we know of in the social community who seem to know more than we do. But do we actively try to gain that experience through our own actions? In other words, at what point do we let go of what the teacher is telling us long enough for ourselves to see, is that what I experience? Because you have to
long enough to it's an interesting term I'm going to use, but to build a body of work.
Yes.
As an artist, we work on building a body of work, or a writer, or whatever. But as a conscious creator as well, our experiences become our body of work. And when we can look back and recognize the experiences we've had, we make a stronger case for ourselves. And things become easier and easier as we build a bigger body of work. So we have to, at some point, like you said, stop just knowing and start doing.
In fact, even if you're a scientist, you're also creating a body of work, because what do scientists do? They gather data. So you're basically creating your own data to gather, because you're going to learn more from your own data than from anybody else's.
Yeah, so no other man's experience can be a substitute for our own. I told the teacher that her change of attitude in regard to another would produce a corresponding change in the other. That such knowledge was the true meaning of the water mentioned in 1 John 5:6. But that such knowledge alone was not enough to produce the rebirth desired. Such rebirth could only come to pass by water and blood, or the application of this truth. Knowledge of what to do is the water of life, but doing it is the blood of the Savior. In other words, a little knowledge, if carried out in action, is more profitable than much knowledge which we neglect to carry out in action. Yes. As I talked, one student kept impinging upon the teacher's mind. But this, thought she, would be a too difficult case on which to test the truth of what I was telling her concerning the mystery of rebirth. All knew, teachers and students alike, that this particular student was incorrigible.
This is going to be good, I can tell.
The outer facts of her case were these. The teachers, including the principal and the school psychiatrist, had sat in judgment on the student just a few days before. They had come to a unanimous decision that the girl, for the good of the school, must be expelled upon reaching her 16th birthday. She was rude, crude, unethical, and used most vile language. The date for dismissal was but a month away.
I'm sorry, I just have to comment on this. Forget for a moment the lessons that Neville's going to teach us. If you're going to expel a student, why do you decide to do it later? I don't get that one.
Well, it may have had to do with whatever the school rules were with age, right?
Perhaps, I suppose. That seems like a bit of a reach to me, but we'll hang on to that one.
Possibly she wouldn't have to be re-enrolled somewhere if she was already 16.
Oh, they were thinking about other schools, and then
maybe, I don't know.
That's possible.
As she rode home that night, the teacher kept wondering if she could really change her mind about the girls, and if so, would the student undergo a change of behavior because she herself had undergone a change of attitude. The only way to find out would be to try. This would be quite an undertaking, for it meant assuming full responsibility for the incarnation of the new values in the student. Did she dare to assume so great a power, such creative, godlike power? This meant a complete reversal of man's normal attitude towards life from, I will love him if he first loves me, to, he loves me because I first loved him. This was too much like playing God.
That's an interesting phrase. This was too much like the... And I imagine, I've never thought of it that way, but I can imagine that there are going to be some people who will say that is like playing God. And I think to myself, really? Wow. But yeah, I can see I might come to that conclusion.
And also, we talked about this when we read in the beginning of the chapter, I said, wow, that's a pretty heavy responsibility you're putting
No
on
kidding.
her. And that's what the teacher was saying here as well, right? Did she dare to assume so great a power?
Yeah. Yeah.
Assuming full responsibility for the incarnation of new values in the student. So she was feeling that weight too. He then quotes 1 John, we love him because he first loved us. And it says, but no matter how she tried to argue against it, the feeling persisted that my interpretation gave meaning to the mystery of rebirth by water and blood. The teacher decided to accept the challenge, and this is what she did. She brought the child's face before her mind's eye and saw her smile. She listened and imagined she heard the girl say, good morning. This was something the student had never done since coming to that school. The teacher imagined the very best about the girl, and then listened and looked as though she heard and saw all that she would hear and see after these things should be. The teacher did this over and over again until she persuaded herself it was true, and she fell asleep. The very next morning, the student entered her classroom and smilingly said, good morning. The teacher was so surprised she almost did not respond, and by her own confession, all through the day she looked for signs of the girl's returning to her former behavior. However, the girl continued in the transformed state. By the end of the week, the change was noted by all. A second staff meeting was called, and a decision of expulsion was revoked. As the child remained friendly and gracious, the teacher has to ask herself, where was the bad child in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
Neville quotes again from Blake, for mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child and care.
Interesting to hear this story. I like it. I like it a lot.
Wow.
But it's particularly interesting to me because it really sounds very much like another school-related story. This is tied to some studies, actual studies that were done primarily in the 1950s and early 1960s. And in these studies, the people doing the study were monitoring the behavior and mainly the learning behavior of kids in a certain grade level of school. And they had, the way they set it up is they would have 3 different classrooms, all of the same grade level, and 3 different teachers. And they would assign this group of people to teacher 1, this group to teacher 2, this group to teacher 3. To the first teacher, they would say, okay, we gave you the top third of the class, so we expect you to produce some pretty good stuff here because you got the best ones. To the second teacher, they said, well, we gave you the ones in the middle, so we're going to give you a little more room to work with, do the best you can with it. And to the third teacher, they say, okay, you got the ones who are at the lower end of the list. You got kind of a challenge on your hands here. See what you can do with it. And at the end of the school year that they were testing, they tested the students. They tested it before and tested afterward. And sure enough, that first group outperformed everybody else. The second group was middling. The third group failed.
And this wasn't true, right?
It wasn't true. No,
right.
They just randomly divided up the students. So the expectations of the teachers had actually driven the production of the students. And that's what I thought of when I heard this story. Basically, how much of that particular student's behavior was driven by the teacher's expectations?
Well, and Neville says that she continued seeing this until she believed it.
Mm-hmm.
And then she fell asleep. So, yeah, so that's interesting to think that there was probably some expectation there of her being different, at least different. Neville says transformation is in principle always possible, for the transformed being lives in us, and it is only a question of becoming conscious of it. The teacher had to experience this transformation to know the mystery of blood and water. There was no other way, and no man's experience could have been a substitute for her own. We have redemption through his blood, he quotes from Ephesians. Without the decision to change her mind in regard to the child and the imaginative power to carry it out, the teacher could never have redeemed the student. None can know the redemptive power of the imagination who has not shed his blood, in quotes, and tasted the cup of experience. Then he quotes Matthew Arnold saying, once read thy own breast right, and thou hast done with fears. Man gets no other light, search he 1,000 years. I think it's really interesting that he did point out her mind changed in regard to the child.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and with your example of the teachers and what they expected, I see that really clearly there, is that her expectation changed. And remember that it was her experience. Yes, it was a shared experience, but if we only look at her experience, she experienced that child, that unruly, crude, rude child was part of her experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're creating our reality with our imagination, then she was thinking of the child that way, and the child changed when her expectation changed. It's pretty powerful.
I'm also reminded that in all of these situations where we're talking about, I am putting something out in the hope that somebody else is going to change their behavior, there has to be a recognition of what I'll call the similar vibration effect.
Right.
In other words, that person has to be receptive to it on some level. It may not be something they've been consciously thinking about, but there has to be a receptivity. If that person is going to be resistant to the change and they're saying, no, 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 then you can think it all you want. It's just not going to have the results that you're looking for. And now there are going to be some people who will argue. I've had people who have argued with me about that, particularly on Facebook, saying, no, 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 that's not what Neville teaches. And I disagree with him respectfully. But the point here is that it isn't so much whether or not the other person changes that matters. That's the way people often look at this. Like,
right.
Well, I need to make this change. He even says it kind of a little bit directly here. He says, without the decision to change her mind in regard to the child and the imaginative power to carry it out, the teacher could never have redeemed the student. But really, did she redeem the student, or did she redeem her own idea of the student?
Right. Yes.
Because I would claim the student redeemed herself.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think the student redeemed herself.
Yeah.
And possibly, one of the things, I think I've talked about this before, but like if I'm coaching a client and I'm feeling resistance, it's because I'm pushing.
That's right.
Right? And so we already see in the story that these teachers got together, they had a meeting, they basically said this child is irredeemable and we're going to expel her at the first time we can. And so that's a lot of resistance, right? They were resisting her. They were resisting her bad behavior. They were resisting everything about her. So what happens when she's met with all that resistance? She pushes back, right? But when she arrives at class and the teacher has no resistance towards her, then it's a different story altogether.
And it's a great point, and it actually, I think, addresses the question that I raised earlier on. I made kind of a joke about it, but it was the idea of, well, why wait until her 16th birthday to expel her from the school? Why not just do it right away? And now I think we know what the answer is. The answer is that deep down, they weren't saying it consciously, but deep down, the teachers kind of knew there was a chance this girl was going to change. How could they know that? Well, because no matter how much we mess ourselves up, but we can do that. We can get ourselves out of alignment really easily. But as much as we can do that, we can always tell deep down, you know what? Something's not quite right here.
Well, because time is going on inside me.
Yeah.
So they knew.
So this is inside me. They knew that on some level. They weren't able to consciously admit to it, but they knew. They knew. Yeah. So great story. I love it.
It was a great chapter as well.
Very good chapter.
I like this whole idea. I told my husband I've never seen anybody change a glass of water into wine. I have seen somebody change a glass of water into Dewar's Scotch, though.
Okay. So they upped the ante. They went to a higher alcohol content.
But I like this metaphor. I like the way this was taught. I like the Neville decoder ring on this one. So this is a good one. Just one more to go. So
I was wondering how he was going to turn this water blood thing into something that would actually be, sensical instead of nonsensical. Yeah.
So far, though, he's never failed us on this.
No, he hasn't.
A couple times it's been like, scratching my head about this. But most of the time he comes through and makes a good, metaphor out of it.
Well, I was thinking about how we had talked in the last few weeks as we were doing this book, how this was one of the books early on that we put off. We put it off because the way we expressed it was, there was so much biblical verse in it.
Yeah.
And I think part of what we were really seeing, I know this is going to be true for my case. If I saw that chapter title back when we were first exploring Neville, that would have just turned me right off.
Right. No, exactly. Like even today when I saw it, I was like, oy vey, this is one of the chapters. This is it. This was the reason why we said, let's not do this book.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it turns out it wasn't quite so bad after all. It was actually quite different from what we originally feared.
Good object lesson. I always think about Job in the Bible. Speaking of the Bible, the thing I feared the most has come to pass. I always think, the thing you fear the most hardly ever comes to pass.
And as Joel Elston points out, when the thing you fear finally comes to pass, it turns out it isn't as bad as what you thought.
Exactly. The problem and the solution are the same thing.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that goes back to what you originally said at the beginning. So yeah, good stuff. So we were kind of hoping between the two of us we'd get through chapter 9. That's not going to happen because we don't have enough time. So we'll have to make that part of what we'll do next week. Actually, it may even tie in nicely next week because next week is just before Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Which is always both a happy time and a difficult time depending on who you are. So I think it'll make an interesting topic to see how do we tie Neville in to the exploration of those concepts.
It's going to be good.
It's going to be very good. So thank you very much, Cindie. As usual, before we go, tell people how to reach Cindie Chavez.
You can find me online at cindiechavez.com, CINDIECHAVEZ.com. And you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter, same name. Reach out, say hello. I'd love to hear from you.
Sounds good. So thank you very much. Thank you, live streamers, and thank you especially to our podcast listeners as well. We'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.